Douglas London retired from the CIA in 2019 after 34 years as a senior operations officer, chief of station, and CIA's counterterrorism chief for South and Southwest Asia. He served primarily in the Middle East, South Asia, the former Soviet republics, and Africa, with senior management positions in the Near East, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, Iran, and cyber operations. Mr. London is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute and is the author of the book The Recruiter: Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence. Mr. London has been a contributor to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Politico, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, The Hill, CNN, Just Security, the Atlantic Council, and the Middle East Initiative. Currently, Mr. London works as an adjunct associate professor in the Georgetown's Center for Security Studies.
So, to talk about how intelligence serves foreign policy, I would submit to you that intelligence offers some sort of privilege, right? There's something beyond just what CNN or Fox News can tell us about things that have happened, but speaks to what they mean and maybe trends that we could identify and inflection points in the direction of our friends, our adversaries, our rivals that helps inform decision making. I would tell you that at CIA, one of my colleagues I thought defined it perfectly, but attributed to me, so I get the credit for it, if you like it. But she said, what we do at CIA is we inform decision makers on things that are unknown, that are uncertain, or that are deliberately concealed. And I found that really fitting. Now, I'm a spy, so deliberately concealed is the part that intrigues me, right? Because for me, that means stealing secrets. But it goes beyond that into this more sort of gray world that we live in, despite the amazing amount of information that's available. We don't have a lot of intelligence available. And when we look at what our policymakers or decision makers want to know, they want to know about plans, intentions, and capabilities. Those really kind of grind down to the most substantive factors that will lead to their calculus in terms of what risk we take, what opportunities are available to us, where our national interests might be threatened. And then if you take that as your comfort level for what intelligence is and what intelligence does, then naturally it's a tool in foreign policy. If foreign policy is how we manage our relations abroad, how we manage our relationships with country, and how we look to protect our national interests abroad. Knowing, particularly knowing what's privileged, if you would, or proprietary, or unknown and uncertain, or deliberately concealed, really gives us an advantage, but also ideally helps us avert tragic mistakes. Now, I don't have to tell you all, history, you look at history and how many times major conflicts have arisen over miscalculations, mistakes based on false information. Even if you look at the Ukraine war, I think very clinically, a lot of Vladimir Putin's decision-making was based on what he believed to be the case in Ukraine, what he believed to be an easy victory for his army, which he had invested extensively into modernizing in his thoughts and equipping against a much smaller adversary, among which he thought there were communities that would welcome Russian troops as liberators, not even just the Russian-speaking parts of the country, but beyond. And he was not well informed. And one of the lessons for the role of intelligence in foreign policy, I think, there is that it wasn't by mistake he was well informed or not well informed. It was the system. It was a systemic failure of his intelligence community because who's going to tell Vladimir Putin what he doesn't want to hear? If your leader has a predisposed opinion and he exercises his power, which is also extends to advancing careers or not advancing careers or promoting people or not promoting people, it's kind of hard to find yourself in a position where you're going to say, oh, Mr. President, you're completely wrong. The Ukrainians are going to fight to the, tooth and nail. They're going to resist us. We're going to have a hard time. Our army is not as effective as we think it is. And I think we need to draw from that a historic lesson on, what the intelligence community needs to do for foreign policy. We've also seen an evolution, I think, on how intelligence serves in foreign policy, particularly in just the last few years. And I think Ukraine was kind of a defining moment of that. But just kind of to step back and give you a sense, right? The intelligence community is what, 18 agencies these days. The 18th is Space Force, by the way. That's always a trick question for me sometimes. That collaborate probably better than they ever have. Mostly, I would offer from personal experience due to the experience of 9/11, where there was a lack of transparency between U.S. agencies and information was not shared as effectively. But these 18 agencies today function both here in the United States, right? They all have their missions, they're all doing their thing, but also abroad. So overseas, the United States has embassies, and every embassy is led by a chief of mission, the ambassador or treasury affair in the absence of the ambassador. But there's kind of a mini representation in every embassy of this entire system of the whole U.S. national security apparatus and the USIC. And it's called the country team. So the heads of every section at an embassy, whether it's the defense attaché or the legal attaché, whatever, they represent their agencies and they support the chief of mission. And remember, the chief of mission is the president's personal representative to that country. And ambassadors really do play a key role in foreign policy decisions. I've been in many meeting, which, for years now, they've been VTCs like we're doing here on Zoom, where there'd be a meeting at the National Security Council. Let's say these days, Mike Waltz is our national security advisor, convening a meeting. There'd be representatives from the different agencies in Washington. There'd be representatives from field commands, CENTCOM, Central Command might chime in from McDill, Florida. And the ambassador, if we're discussing one specific country, might be on the line as well, coming in from overseas, maybe the chief of station, maybe some other people, because it really is a team sport. And the evolution of which I'm speaking has been this rise of intelligence diplomacy. I don't know how much you might have read about it or heard about it or thought about it, but when we think of diplomacy, and in the old days, we used to define national instruments of power as 9, right? It was like diplomatic, information, military, and economic. That definition in today's age might need to expand somewhat, but that's maybe for another day. But the idea of diplomacy was really single focused on, well, this is our official representatives. These are our diplomats. This is the ambassador and his or her team, and State Department, and yeah, different agencies have their representatives abroad, certainly, and talking to people, talking to their foreign counterparts. But the United States has become very focused on leveraging intelligence in diplomacy. Historically, when you look at that, I could go back to the Cold War, at least in the early 80s, where we had an agent in Poland. This is Warsaw Pact days. This is the days of the Soviet Union. His name was Kuklinski, General Kuklinski. There's a great book written about him called A Secret Life. And after you buy my book, The Recruiter, and buy many copies of it for your friends and family, buy A Secret Life. And Kuklinski was a Polish colonel, full colonel, could have been promoted to general. He was actually earmarked for general, but chose assignments where his access to intelligence would be better. And his position was as he was the assistant to the chief of the General Army Staff. So he had complete insight all of Poland's military plans, what was going on in the country. He also dealt with the Soviet Union as a counterpart in coming up with plans. And these were the days of solidarity in Poland. right? Where trade unions were coming to rise, they were challenging the communist regime. This is 1980, 1981. The Soviet Union, which had invaded Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, did not like organic movements, grass movements challenging the Communist Party. And Mr. Kuklinski came to learn that the Soviet Union was planning to invade Poland. And he shared this intelligence with us, obviously. In fact, during a period of time where it was kind of mounting and escalating, he was taking tremendous risks because I will tell you, as someone who's handled very sensitive agents in what we call denied areas, which are places where there's a lot more bad guys than us and they don't like us very much, like Russia and China, for example, or the Warsaw Pact in the days. Every time he tried to communicate with us, whether in person or digitally, he had a means to contact us digitally, or a means to use dead drops. You've probably seen the movies, dead drops, like leaving something that could be picked up and vice versa, was a tremendous operational risk. But Colonel Kuklinski felt so obliged to protect his country, which is why he was working for us in the first place. He was a loyal Pole. He felt his government was not loyal to Poland and doing it harm. And if you read some of the history and the books and the war plans, Poland was basically the expendable venue for what the then Soviet Union expected to be the conflict, the war, including the use of nuclear weapons. And he was aware of that as well. So he made us aware of Soviet plans, the fact that the Polish government, at this time being led by his former boss, General Jaruzelski, I think his name was, who was chief of army staff for whom he worked and then became the president, what they were going to do. And the United States government was like, okay, what are we going to do to stop the Soviets? They decided to use some of this intelligence that Kuklinski provided, not sharing it publicly like we've seen in Ukraine and concerning Russia and China, but with our allies and with the Soviet Union. And basically said, we need to prepare. The Soviets are definitely planning to invade. We need to start organizing. And concurrent with this, again, if you look in your history, there was this big struggle over intermediate nuclear missiles and positioning them in Europe. And the Soviet Union was very much trying to keep the Europeans from accepting these US missiles and such. So Brzezinski was the national security advisor. Jimmy Carter was the president at the time. And we started passing this information to our allies, but in a way that we also knew would get back to the Soviet Union and start signaling our preparations, which could have included a red line for war, possibly. And the Soviet Union changed their plans. And in my lifetime, anyway, I think this might have been one of the first uses of intelligence diplomacy. In the 90s, we saw the United States very heavily involved in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Fatah, in Wye River and in Oslo, where my old boss, former DCI tenant, was the point person. It was DCI tenant holding the meetings between Arafat and Begin and the Israelis and such like that. Again, that was intelligence diplomacy. And in these past 4 or 5 years, and I think a great example is 2021 and 2022 when the Russians did invade Ukraine, we saw the United States going out and declassifying intelligence from all various sources to say, we know that these massive troops along Ukraine's borders are intending to invade. Our European allies were actually skeptical. Of all of our allies, only the British shared our opinion. Every single other NATO partner said, no, he's doing the same thing he did a year ago. Because a year prior, the Russians had done the same. They had massed maybe or the same number, about 100,000 troops around Ukraine, flexed their muscles, that it was an exercise, was a drill, and then they pulled their forces back. But this time, they were going to invade, and we knew it because we had good intelligence. Good intelligence that we had to put at risk, as well as the sources from which that intelligence came, in order to declassify it not just to our allies, because we could have given it to our allies officially, right? I can't tell you how many times that I went to a foreign partner and had what we would call a tear line, right? It was an information report or or a request of some sort, which was still classified in the sense that it was proprietary between us and them, but not for the press, not for the general public. But we were just like making announcements, putting this stuff out there, giving it to reporters and such like that, because beyond persuading our partners to come on board and to not just accept what was going on, but at least to start planning in the event of it, it was also an effort to court international public opinion. Because that international public opinion would in turn create political pressure on the Germans and the Norwegians and name your country to do something about it. In days of old, the CIA was very busy in the covert influence business, right? Where we could go ahead and place things in newspapers or radio stations and have a reporter on our payroll. But it is against the law for the CIA to put out propaganda, disinformation, what have you, if you would, that could circulate back in the United States. 1970, 1980, that's such a big deal. I could, recruit an agent in Spain or Jordan who's a newspaper person, put in a newspaper, it's not going to show up. But, today, you can't put anything anywhere that you can't be certain isn't going to float back to the United States. So if we can't covertly make up stuff, we started using the real stuff, started using real intelligence and trying to find that sweet spot where we could declassify it to a point where we get across the most important content without compromising our sources' methods. And we use that today very heavily in diplomacy, very officially. You just Google search for declassified intelligence on China when we were trying to discourage China from selling or providing military wares to Russia, to the Iranians, making the connections between what the Iranians and the Russians were doing with the Shahed drones, even though both sides were initially denying it, basically taking intel and all of this to serve as an instrument of power in terms of foreign policy, in terms of diplomacy. I think we'll see more of that, not less of that, because it's actually been pretty effective. But where does the U.S. get all this intelligence anyway? Right? What are the sources of information? And I won't be too Socratic and put you on the spot. I'm also mindful on time. But there's 6 means of collecting intelligence, right? And this is fun when I get to be Socratic, but I won't do that to you. But my favorite, obviously, is human intelligence operations, because that's people. And only a fraction of human is what I do, is stealing secrets. Most of human is open, right? Talked about our embassies, our country teams. The FBI legal attaché is talking to the local law enforcement. Our defense attaché is being given tours of military bases, getting to watch military exercises, invited to all sorts of functions. Obviously, the diplomatic officers at the embassy are representing, reporting, trying to take a pulse of what people are thinking on the feet. None of that's classified. None of that's secret. Well, in places like North Korea, it's secret. I served in one country where a map was a classified document. There were no maps in the country because it was considered a classified document. The good old days. But most of that is what constitutes human. The CIA in the IC, this is actually how it's known, is considered the collector of last resort. That's how it's referred to. And when intelligence plans are put together, like what do we need? What do our policymakers need? And again, it may be trivia for you at this point. It's done in the framework of the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, NIPIT. People are handed out with their assignments, right? And when humans is looked at, CIA is always reserved for the things that are the most risky, and not just because we're cool, but we're small, kind of expendable, I suppose, in a way. But we're not going to worry as much about the blowback. If a DoD collector is going to do something, or an FBI, it could really hurt their equities with the foreign government, where people expect us to steal. That's what we do, right? So you've got human, which is my favorite. Um, What kind of collection is this? If they're taking it off your phones or your computers, what's called, or radio transmission? Signals intelligence, right? SIGINT, which comprises cyber as well. That's all signals intelligence. NSA is the shepherd of that, but NSA is not the only agency that does SIGINT. They're the manager of SIGINT, just like CIA is the manager of HUMINT. We're not the only agency that does HUMINT. There's imagery intelligence, satellites, drones, all the pictures and stuff that you might collect. There is open source intelligence, which is telephone, news, and all the things that we can collect, all the information that we could collect and try to analyze and take apart. There's GeoInt, which became very popular during the War on Terror, which is essentially fixing locations of places or people. And the last one, it's always where I stump people, is MASIN. It's materials and signature intelligence. So you'll read probably case studies or how we detected that a country was developing a nuclear weapon or whatever, because some schmo like me may be going for a picnic someplace and take a sample of water or soil near a questionable facility and see what's in the air, what's in the water, what's in the ground, what are the acoustics if it's underwater, right? What are the electric currents? Ways that we can tell from a signature something that's going on. And it's from these 6 basic sources of intelligence, the raw reporting, right, that we collect all this information and then we analyze it and then we write products on it, right, to hopefully inform the decision making of folks. And those products are generally available to all the folks in this enterprise, in the foreign policy enterprise, from the ambassador overseas to various people, Treasury, for example. Treasury is a huge player in the foreign policy field. If you think about sanctions and these days tariffs and in the counterterrorism world, tracking the money, criminal world, tracking the money. It's a huge player. So they'll be getting all this intelligence, as well as, people in the military commands, the combatant commanders and such like that. So all this information, in theory, is to fuel the enterprise of foreign policy making, where we have an insight to what is beyond the information, what is beyond the headlines, to give our policymakers and decision makers some sense on what are the plans and intentions and capabilities of friend and foe alike, as we have to think about protecting and advancing our interests abroad. So today is no different than it's always been. Intelligence has always played a key role in supporting foreign policy. But I think personally, it's even bigger today because it's taken on a much bigger diplomatic face. CIA, remembers, has relationships with all these different foreign partners, including enemies. We see the FSB, we see the SVR. We go to their office, we talk to them, in theory, to talk about mutually compatible issues like terrorism. But those relationships also give us a channel of communications. In the end of 2023, I think it was, former DCIA Burns traveled to Turkey to meet with his counterpart, the head of the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, a man named Narishkin, because we believed that the Russians were seriously thinking of using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, a tactical nuclear weapon. Maybe not in combat, but maybe even as a sign of show that they have the capability to use it, which is a big red line in U.S. national security, by the way, and has been for many, many years. And a couple of former defense secretaries have commented on it much more articulately and transparently than I'm allowed to. But Mr. Burns went to Turkey, and from the news, at least we could see, he basically said, if you use a nuclear weapon, and we know you're actually thinking about it seriously, here's the consequences. And the Russians desisted from that. That was intelligence diplomacy. So there's a whole lot of kind of bits and pieces and aspects when you think about collaboration, coordination, who's in charge, Secretary of State, whatever like that. It is the Secretary of State. Foreign policy is a domain of the State Department. Intelligence serves as a complement to it, but it serves as a very useful and effective complement, I would say.